The envelope was stamped "Top Secret." Inside were 5 names, men who had once walked the ivy-clad courtyards of Cambridge, laughing beneath ancient towers, debating philosophy over tea. They were scholars, dreamers, men of privilege and intellect, unaware that history would one day brand them as traitors. They were not driven by greed or ambition, but by conviction. A conviction that the world they lived in was corrupt and needed to be challenged. These 5 men would go on to infiltrate the highest circles of British intelligence, not as enemies, but as believers in a cause they deemed greater. Before we deep dive, if you love spy wars like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next classified file, and tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I love knowing how far these shadows travel. The 1930s were years of turmoil, uncertainty, and awakening. Britain, proud of its empire, masked deep social inequality and unrest. Across Europe, new tyrannies were rising. Fascism spreading in Germany, Italy, and Spain, while democracies wavered. Within Cambridge, young men of privilege began questioning the foundations of their world. Libraries and dormitories became arenas for debates about morality, loyalty, and justice. The students saw a world where ideals were hollow, where power served itself, and they began to imagine a different order. Harold Kim. Philby was one of them. Handsome, articulate, and born into influence, he seemed destined for a life of comfort and authority. But he saw the contradictions of his country's morality. Wealth wielded without conscience, privilege exercised without responsibility, and a nation preaching freedom abroad while oppressing at home. For Philby, communism was not tyranny, but clarity, an answer to a corrupt system. Fascination soon became conviction, and conviction would become action. Guy Burgess was his opposite, loud, eccentric, magnetic. He could charm, provoke, or unsettle anyone with equal ease. Donald Maclean, quiet and meticulous, carried his convictions with moral weight. Anthony Blunt, the refined art scholar, saw beauty as truth and applied the same principle to ideology. John Cairncross, shy and studious, possessed a mind of quiet calculation. Together they formed a circle that would begin in ideas but end in actions capable of altering the course of history. Their formation as a network was subtle, almost invisible. Meetings took place in smoky rooms or quiet corners of the university, where whispered debates about justice and loyalty blurred the line between idealism and betrayal. The Spanish Civil War became their moral test. While Britain's elite observed from a distance, indifferent or neutral, these young men felt compelled to act. Loyalty, they decided, was owed not to a nation or flag, but to principle itself. And when the opportunity to serve that principle arose, the transition from student to spy was almost seamless. By the late 1930s, each man had embedded himself in positions of influence. Philby became a journalist in Spain, witnessing the brutality of war firsthand, all while covertly passing intelligence to a distant power he believed represented justice. Burgess maneuvered into government offices, Maclean into diplomacy, Blunt into domestic intelligence, and Cairncross into code-breaking. Each position offered access to secrets unimaginable to ordinary observers, and yet no one suspected the quiet subversion taking place within the heart of Britain's institutions. What they did felt righteous. Betrayal, in their minds, was not treason, but a moral imperative, a necessary deception to confront hypocrisy. The information they provided would alter the course of wars and intelligence operations, though few would ever understand their motives. They were young, brilliant, and untouchable, convinced that their actions were building a fairer world, unaware that the shadows they created would outlive them. By the outbreak of the Second World War, the Cambridge Five were invisible forces within British intelligence. Philby's reputation soared, Burgess's influence expanded, and Maclean's diplomatic access was unmatched. Blunt and Cairncross operated quietly but effectively, each thread of their network extending into the deepest corners of power. They attended high society events, mingled with ministers and generals, and smiled for cameras, all while their allegiance flowed undetected. The Empire trusted its defenders, unaware that the most dangerous threat came from within. Even as London burned under the Blitz, the Five moved with precision, their conviction unwavering. Each telegram, document, and conversation could shift the balance of life and death for thousands. To them, it was not betrayal, it was justice. Yet, behind their calm professionalism, a storm was gathering. A storm that would unravel reputations, careers, and the illusion of Britain's intelligence supremacy. By the end of the war, Britain had survived, but its intelligence community had been quietly compromised. The Five had passed secrets that would shape the post-war world. Their motives were complex, their methods invisible, and their legacy debated for decades. They were not merely spies or traitors, they were men who challenged their world and reshaped it in shadows, leaving only questions, mysteries, and consequences that would echo long after their actions were complete. The war had begun, and Europe was aflame. Cities burned, governments collapsed, armies clashed, and millions suffered. Yet amid the chaos of battlefields and bombed-out streets, another war raged quietly. One hidden in offices, embassies, and secret chambers. It was a war of shadows, fought not with guns and bombs, but with ink, ciphers, and silent observation. The Cambridge Five had stepped fully into this world, carrying with them ideals that would both guide and haunt them for decades. Philby, now officially part of Britain's intelligence apparatus, moved with the ease of a man who belonged. He was charming, efficient, and utterly convincing. The perfect cover for someone feeding secrets to a foreign power. Each report he filed, each operation he oversaw, was a calculated performance. To his colleagues, he was loyal, patriotic, indispensable. To Moscow, he was a conduit, a channel through which the British Empire unknowingly revealed its inner workings. His mind was a battlefield, balancing allegiance to a nation he served by day and to an ideology he believed in by night. Every meeting, every dispatch, was a delicate negotiation of trust and deceit. Burgess, with his flamboyant personality, became a master of infiltration in high society circles and government offices alike. His laughter and ease disarmed suspicion. He charmed officials, journalists, and diplomats, collecting intelligence casually, almost invisibly. Maclean, meticulous and methodical, navigated the corridors of diplomacy with precision. The Foreign Office had no idea that its most promising officers were quietly supplying information to the enemy of its supposed enemy. Blunt, refining his position in domestic intelligence, quietly extracted and relayed documents. Cairncross, immersed in the world of cryptography, deciphered communications and passed sensitive intelligence, along without ever raising eyebrows. Together, their influence was seamless, nearly invisible, like threads woven into a grand tapestry that only the unseen could understand. The Five operated with a discipline that belied their youth. Their methods were subtle, notes hidden in newspapers, meetings disguised as casual encounters, coded messages disguised in correspondence. They moved among their colleagues with the poise of gentlemen, their actions unnoticed because no one dared imagine that Britain's most talented minds could be working for another power. And yet, they were always watching, always calculating. One misstep could destroy them. One wrong word could unravel years of careful planning. Every day was a test, a negotiation between truth and deception. The intelligence they provided to Moscow was astonishing in scope. Battle plans, diplomatic cables, naval movements, and even post-war strategies flowed through their hands. Philby, for instance, passed along sensitive intelligence about German operations during the war. Maclean's diplomatic insights into Anglo-American negotiations became a treasure trove of information for the Soviets. The British Empire, fighting fascism abroad, unknowingly compromised its own advantage. And all the while, the Five justified their actions through ideology, believing that they were fighting a greater battle, one not for country, but for principles. As Britain fought for survival under relentless bombing campaigns, the Five remained calm, almost serene in contrast to the chaos around them. London burned, sirens wailed, and civilians fled for shelter. But inside the offices of MI6 and the Foreign Office, the quiet war continued. Documents were typed, messengers dispatched, meetings convened, and none suspected that every secret was already passing through the hands of traitors they trusted. The audacity of the Cambridge Five lay not only in what they did, but in how invisible they remained. Their loyalty appeared absolute, their competence unquestioned, and their morality, to the untrained eye, unimpeachable. Yet the war was not merely external. Tension inside Britain's intelligence community was growing, though no one suspected the true cause. Reports went missing, operations failed inexplicably, and trusted informants vanished without explanation. Heads shook, theories circulated, but the Five's presence remained undetected. Their successes were cloaked in normalcy, their betrayals were hidden by genius. Every clever manipulation, every secret passed to Moscow was executed with the precision of chess masters, several moves ahead of their contemporaries. The ideological underpinning of their actions was complex. They believed that the British Empire, though fighting fascism abroad, was morally compromised at home and in its colonies. Communism, despite its flaws, offered clarity, purpose, and justice. The Five saw themselves not as traitors, but as men balancing scales that had long been unbalanced. To them, the Soviets were allies in a moral fight, not enemies in a political one. Each classified document they passed was a carefully considered contribution to a vision of the world that existed in their minds alone, far removed from national loyalty. As the war reached its height, the Five's operations intensified. Philby's access within MI6 allowed him to influence counterintelligence, monitor German spies, and even manage operations involving British double agents. Burgess's charm opened doors in the highest diplomatic circles, granting him unparalleled access to sensitive negotiations. Maclean, stationed in Washington, observed the delicate interplay between Britain and its allies, passing details that would later shape the post-war intelligence landscape. Blunt, ever the scholar, handled domestic intelligence with efficiency and subtlety, while Cairncross quietly decrypted crucial communications that would reach Moscow. Every action, every step was calibrated, invisible to the untrained eye, but devastating in its consequences. Despite their effectiveness, the psychological strain was immense. Living dual lives demanded constant vigilance. Every smile, every handshake, every casual conversation could be a trap. Each of the Five maintained an outward composure that masked inner turbulence. Philby wrote reports with confidence, yet knew that a single miscalculation could end his life. Burgess navigated high society gatherings, his flamboyance a cloak for deadly purpose. Maclean's meticulous nature ensured he left no trace, yet paranoia lingered at the edges of every operation. Blunt and Cairncross operated quietly, their minds constantly balancing morality, loyalty, and survival. The tension between conviction and fear shaped every decision, every secret, every lie. By the end of the war, the Cambridge Five had achieved what few could imagine: complete infiltration of Britain's intelligence network. They had passed strategic intelligence, influenced military operations, and manipulated the perception of allies and enemies alike. They were, in effect, invisible commanders of a war that no one saw. Yet, even in their success, there were shadows. Relationships strained, suspicions quietly arose, and the consequences of their actions would not remain hidden forever. For now, though, They were untouchable, moving through the post-war landscape with the calm confidence of those who understood the invisible threads of power better than anyone else. The war had ended, but the invisible war would continue. Britain would rebuild, strategize, and reorganize, unaware that some of its most trusted agents were already shaping the course of the Cold War in another capital, another ideology. The Five were no longer students, no longer mere idealists. They were operatives, masters of deception, and architects of betrayal. And though the bombs had ceased falling, the quiet, meticulous operations of the Cambridge Five would echo across decades, leaving traces of influence, mystery, and silent questions that no historian could fully untangle. As Europe recovered, the shadow of the Five stretched across borders, embassies, and intelligence files. Their methods, motives, and secrets were invisible to those around them, yet powerful enough to alter destinies. They were not reckless. They were precise. They were not traitors in the eyes they valued, only loyal to a vision of justice they had created for themselves. And while the world celebrated victory over fascism, the true story of Britain's internal vulnerabilities remained untold. A story that would only emerge slowly, painfully, and in whispers as the Cold War tightened its grip. The Cambridge Five had become legends, though not in the way the world would initially understand. Their brilliance lay in invisibility, their power in ideology, and their legacy in shadows. Every file, every telegram, every handshake carried the weight of secrets that would define international intelligence for decades to come. And as they moved through the corridors of post-war Britain, their lives intertwined with diplomacy, espionage, and morality, the question remained: who truly won in a war fought in shadows? By the early 1950s, the invisible war that the Cambridge Five had waged for more than a decade began to show cracks. The world had shifted. The Second World War was over, but its aftermath gave birth to the Cold War, a conflict defined by paranoia, secrecy, and suspicion. Britain, once triumphant, now faced scrutiny from allies who were no longer certain that intelligence could be trusted. Within the upper echelons of MI6 and the Foreign Office, whispers began circulating, suspicions growing like shadows in quiet corridors. Documents were disappearing. Operations failed inexplicably. Yet no one suspected the full scale of the betrayal. That the very men trusted with Britain's secrets were the ones undermining them. It began with small anomalies, misplaced files, unusual patterns in intelligence transmissions, and discrepancies noted by American analysts. The Five had always been careful, but the rise of sophisticated counterintelligence methods meant even the most careful could no longer operate with impunity. The Americans, having intercepted coded Soviet communications, began piecing together a picture of a mole, a spy embedded deep within British intelligence. And yet, the British establishment, slow to accept that such treachery could originate from within, initially dismissed these warnings. The perfect camouflage of the Five was their brilliance and their class. How could the Empire's finest minds be traitors? In 1951, the first dramatic exposure occurred. Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean, sensing that suspicions were closing in, vanished overnight. Their disappearance shocked the nation and humiliated British intelligence. Airplanes were watched, borders monitored, and frantic investigations began. But by the time MI6 realized what had happened, Burgess and Maclean had crossed into Moscow's embrace. Their escape was both audacious and devastating. A silent confession that the spy network within Britain was far deeper than anyone had imagined. The Empire's golden sons had defected, leaving behind chaos, confusion, and unanswered questions. Philby, meanwhile, stood in the eye of the storm. Suspicion had turned toward him, yet no evidence was conclusive. He navigated inquiries with the calm assurance of a man who knew both his superiors and his enemy. Meetings were attended, statements given, and rumors circulated. Every interaction required precise calculation. A single misstep could cost him his life, yet he remained outwardly unshakable. To colleagues, he was the consummate gentleman, the trusted officer, the loyal servant of Britain. To Moscow, he was a hero, a conduit for intelligence that would shape the coming decades. His duality was extraordinary, a masterclass in deception that few could comprehend. The fallout from Burgess and Maclean's defection sent shockwaves across British intelligence. Careers were destroyed, trust eroded, and an air of suspicion permeated every office. MI6 faced embarrassment, not only from the betrayal, but from the fact that their closest allies, the Americans, had been watching the situation unfold with incredulity. It was a bitter lesson. Brilliance and class could conceal treachery, but not indefinitely. And as the hunt intensified, Philby became the focus of both scrutiny and awe. His ability to maintain cover was unparalleled, but every day brought new risks. Every conversation, every telegram, every assignment was a test of his nerve and his loyalty to the cause he had chosen. Anthony Blunt and John Cairncross, while less publicly exposed, were not immune to the growing tension. Blunt's role in domestic intelligence kept him in constant proximity to inquiries, while Cairncross's work in code-breaking offered immense access to sensitive information. Both understood that the walls were closing in, that the Empire's gaze was sharpening. Yet they continued their work, balancing risk with ideology. Their actions, once abstract and intellectual, now carried the tangible weight of potential discovery. The invisible war had become perilously close to the surface, and the shadows they had relied upon were thinning. Philby's personal life became a careful performance. He entertained diplomats, attended high society events, and maintained a reputation so spotless that suspicion seemed almost absurd. Even as internal memos hinted at potential betrayal, he remained a figure of authority and charm. He manipulated perception with ease, ensuring that every doubt was reframed as loyalty. Behind closed doors, he wrestled with fear and pragmatism. Every intercepted message, every cautious remark from a colleague was assessed for risk. The duality of his life, patriot by day, agent by night, required constant vigilance. It was a delicate dance, and the stakes had never been higher. The defection of Burgess and Maclean forced Britain to confront uncomfortable truths. The idea that members of the establishment could betray their nation seemed almost unthinkable. Yet, in the aftermath, the Five's ideological motivations began to emerge. They had acted not for personal gain, but for conviction, believing that the British Empire was morally compromised, and that their loyalty lay with principles, not flags. This belief did not absolve the consequences, but it provided context. These men were operating on a different plane, one where ideology eclipsed nationalism. Their vision was radical, dangerous, and uncompromising. By 1953, Philby's position became untenable. Inquiries intensified, colleagues whispered, and the pressure mounted. He was advised to resign or face exposure, but he remained defiant. The game had changed. No longer a war of documents and secret messages, but a psychological struggle, testing nerves, loyalty, and intelligence. Philby's calm, strategic brilliance allowed him to survive scrutiny, earning him both admiration and suspicion. His ability to maintain composure, even as evidence against him accumulated, became legendary, illustrating both the audacity and the peril of espionage at the highest level. Meanwhile, the world watched unknowingly. The Cold War's early stages were shaped by intelligence that the Cambridge Five provided. Moscow gained insights into British operations, diplomatic intentions, and Western strategy, all facilitated by men who had been celebrated as Britain's brightest. The invisible war they waged had consequences that extended far beyond London's corridors, influencing geopolitics, strategy, and the emerging balance of power. The complexity of their loyalty to ideology over nation would haunt international intelligence for decades to come. Finally, in 1963, Philby made the choice that would cement his place in history. Realizing that his cover could no longer be maintained indefinitely, he defected to Moscow, joining the friends he had once outrun. He left behind a country he had served, colleagues who trusted him, and a legacy that combined brilliance, betrayal, and ideology. His defection was both an ending and a continuation, the closure of one chapter of espionage and the opening of another, in a world increasingly defined by shadows and secrets. The Cambridge Five, by the early 1960s, had transformed from students to spies, from idealists to architects of betrayal. Their actions had exposed the fragility of British intelligence, the limits of trust, and the moral complexities of allegiance. They had lived lives of extraordinary duplicity, walking a line between patriotism and ideology, brilliance and betrayal. And as the Cold War deepened, the echoes of their operations would continue to shape the invisible battles that defined the second half of the 20th century. Their story was one of audacity and danger, of intelligence and ideology intertwined. They had infiltrated the heart of an empire, manipulated its trust, and reshaped the understanding of espionage forever. For Philby, Burgess, Maclean, Blunt, and Cairncross, loyalty was never simple, and betrayal was never clear-cut. They were products of their time, of privilege, of ideology, and of a world in which shadows could speak louder than governments. And in the quiet aftermath of exposure and escape, one truth remained. The invisible war had only just begun. The Cold War had settled over Europe like a long, silent winter. Nations rebuilt, borders hardened, and intelligence agencies became both sword and shield in a new invisible battlefield. For the Cambridge Five, the war had ended, but their personal battles were far from over. They had traded classrooms for embassies, lecture halls for intelligence offices, and youthful idealism for a life of shadows. By now, the world had begun to take note. The disappearances, the defection, the whispered suspicions. Yet the full story remained fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle scattered across continents and decades. Philby, the most enigmatic of the five, had arrived in Moscow under a veil of both relief and uncertainty. He was greeted as a hero, celebrated by those who valued ideology above nation. Yet the comforts of recognition could not erase years of tension, of living a life split between two worlds. He had left behind colleagues, friends, and a country that had once embraced him. In Moscow, he found familiarity in the principles that had guided his espionage, yet also isolation. Trust was hard-won in a foreign land, and he learned that even in victory, shadows could be lonelier than the coldest night in London. Burgess and Maclean, already decades removed from Britain, adjusted to life in exile. Burgess, flamboyant and restless, found Moscow stimulating yet confining, a city of bureaucracy and rigid structure that contrasted sharply with the freedom of his earlier escapades. Maclean, disciplined and contemplative, sought solace in work, contributing to intelligence operations from a distance, always aware that the world he had left behind was both his enemy and his history. Their lives were defined by a duality of freedom and captivity. Freedom from Britain, captivity within the ideology that had dictated their choices. Blunt, meanwhile, remained in Britain, concealed in plain sight. For decades, he continued his work, moving among colleagues who would never suspect his duplicity. It was a quiet, perilous existence, a study in patience and endurance. Cairncross, similarly, maintained his cover while quietly feeding information to the other side. Both men understood the delicate balance of loyalty and survival, and the psychological toll it took was immense. Living a lie, even for conviction, demanded a constant negotiation between conscience and necessity. Each day was an exercise in subtlety, a rehearsal for deception perfected over years. The legacy of the Cambridge Five extended far beyond their personal fates. They had demonstrated that intelligence was not merely a matter of documents or operations, but of human judgment, of ideology, and of psychology. One man's loyalty could mask another's betrayal, and appearances were often more powerful than truth. Their actions exposed the vulnerability of institutions, the perils of blind trust, and the moral ambiguities of espionage. Britain's empire, celebrated for its intelligence acumen, had been infiltrated by its brightest minds, a humbling lesson in the power of shadows. For Philby, the years in Moscow were bittersweet. He had achieved recognition, security, and validation, yet the human cost weighed heavily. Friends lost, colleagues deceived, and a homeland betrayed. These were the ghosts that accompanied him. He spoke often of ideology and duty, but the solitude of exile reminded him that espionage, no matter how principled, exacts a toll. Burgess and Maclean faced similar realities, their flamboyance and precision tempered by the isolation of living far from the world they had known. Ideals had carried them through, but reality remained unyielding. Blunt's eventual exposure, decades later, revealed the final layers of the Five's story. Quietly unmasked, he faced scrutiny, public embarrassment, and historical judgment. Yet even in revelation, he maintained composure, a testament to the careful, measured life he had led in secrecy. Cairncross, too, would eventually be recognized, his contributions and betrayals examined in the light of history. Their stories reminded the world that espionage is a human endeavor, one that blends intellect, morality, and the perpetual tension between belief and loyalty. The Cambridge Five's influence persisted in ways unseen and subtle. Intelligence agencies restructured, protocols tightened, and trust became a commodity more guarded than ever before. Yet the lessons of their actions endured. Brilliance and ideology could undermine even the most powerful institutions. Loyalty was never absolute, and shadows, when skillfully wielded, could alter history. The empire had survived their betrayal, but the world of espionage had been indelibly changed. In the corridors of MI6, in diplomatic offices, in code-breaking centers, their legacy lingered, a reminder that some battles are fought not with guns, but with minds, courage, and conviction. By the late 20th century, the Cambridge Five were legends, not as heroes, not merely as villains, but as symbols of the complex moral universe of espionage. They were men whose brilliance and idealism had propelled them to heights unimaginable, yet whose choices left scars on nations, institutions, and individuals. They had lived in shadows, mastered the art of deception, and redefined what it meant to be loyal or disloyal. History would debate their motives endlessly, weighing ideology against betrayal, conviction against consequence. And yet, there remained one truth beyond argument. The Cambridge Five had reshaped the landscape of intelligence. Their actions, their choices, their secrets. These were forces that continued to ripple through the Cold War and beyond. They had demonstrated that the human element, belief, intellect, courage, fear, could change the course of nations. They had turned loyalty into ambiguity, betrayal into principle, and the invisible war into a legacy that would haunt history. If you thought this mission was wild, wait until you hear about the next one. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Every shadow hides a story, every secret carries a consequence, and every spy leaves a legacy that history can barely imagine. The Cambridge Five were ghosts of loyalty and conviction, and their story remains one of the most chilling and fascinating chapters in the hidden world of espionage.